Football's back. This weekend saw the big kick-off in the English Premier League, but what of young Palestinians who dream of one day playing for Liverpool or Manchester United? Palestinian players have been arrested, detained and in some cases shot by the Israeli army. So, is it time for a sporting boycott of Israel? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. It was one of the most shocking images of Israel's assault on Gaza. 4 boys aged between 9 and 11 wiped out by an Israeli shell as they ran for their lives. They had been playing football on the beach. The dreams they may have had to one day play the game professionally for their favourite team will never be fulfilled. In fact, for children in Gaza, it can be difficult to play anywhere. The United Nations describes the level of destruction from Israel's bombardment as unprecedented, and sports facilities, like hospitals and schools, have been among the targets. Jane Ferguson has sent us this report.
This is one of only 2 football stadiums in Gaza City. It was badly damaged during the 2012 war here. After that, officials from FIFA did visit to assess the damage and begin fixing this stadium. However, as you can see, it's not nearly finished and won't be ready for a long time for footballers to come back here. One of the challenges for those trying to run these sorts of facilities is the fact that every few years now they seem to have to contend with a war. There have been 3 wars here since 2008, during which time things like this get destroyed. The materials that are here also have to contend with the fact that there is still a blockade on Gaza. Just construction materials can be very difficult to get in. Also, in terms of funding, anyone trying to maintain this sort of facility is having to contend with other things that are often higher on the priority list for the authorities here, such as hospitals and schools.
Now, in the occupied West Bank 3 days ago, 2 Palestinian footballers, Mohamed Khatari and Uday Jabba, were killed in protests. So, even in times of relative calm, sportsmen and women have been harassed, arrested and detained by Israeli security forces. Jabil Rajoub is president of the Palestinian Football Authority.
The main obstacle is the Israeli occupation and their treatment, dealing with the Palestinian sport community through hatred and enmity, restricting the movement of the athletes, the staff, the officials, restricting even the movement of our national teams, whether it's men or women, from inside to outside and even inside the Palestinian occupied territories.
Well, let's bring in our guest for this edition of Inside Story. In London, Luther Blisset, a former professional footballer and coach and ambassador for the show Racism, the Red Card. Uriel Sturm is sports editor of the Jerusalem Post and head of the American Football League in Israel. And finally in Glasgow, Pauline McNeill, a former member of the Scottish Parliament and chair of the Middle East and North Africa Forum in Scotland, which campaigns for Palestinian rights. For all of my guests, thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Mr. Sturm, can I come to you first in Jerusalem? Just your initial thoughts about Palestinian football and the relationship it has with Israel.
My initial thoughts are, first of all, it's definitely peace is on the forefront of everyone's mind here, both in Jerusalem and in Palestine. Both groups of civilians really, all they want is peace, and for things such as sport to be able to come back to the forefront of their daily lives, where security is not something that they're considering on an hourly basis, and they're able to just enjoy things such as playing football, which is something that sort of is indicative of life going on as normal. When I try to think of the Palestinian relationship and Palestinian football players and the Israeli society, it's important to note that when you look in general at the Israeli football, there's a tremendous amount of emphasis placed on coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians and all other Arab type of background players. The Israeli Football League, the National League, the Premier League in Israel, every club except for one does have Palestinian and Arab football players, Muslim football players playing. The Israeli national team currently has 4 Muslim football players. The Paris Center for Peace is one of the many different organizations that tries to promote peace through sport. And that's something that I think is a very positive value that could be brought out of sport in the big picture.
How difficult then, when you hear of these incidents of the likes of Palestinian footballers and athletes having their movements restricted, how much does that cause a problem for you when you're trying to promote a better harmony, you might say, in the game in Israel and between Israel and Palestine as 2 national teams?
It's difficult because we're talking about a burgeoning nation in Palestine. It's not a nation that has a tremendous amount of sports history when it comes to the international stage. And so, yes, even conceding we're talking about 2 different national entities, Israel and Palestine, we're talking about a situation where one of them is very new to the whole infrastructure of international play. Israel is also quite new. We're talking about a nation that's 60 years old, and we also are still dealing with the growing pains of having to get into the international stages of sports at every level.
Okay, let me bring in then the other guests.
Whether it's other type of sports.
Let me bring in Pauline McNeill, firstly, in Glasgow. The general impression of what's going on in the Middle East reverberates around the world, and different news organisations, different people contemplate their own perspective on what's being seen. Hopefully, the fact is what they see is the truth. In terms of Scotland, Scotland's always stood out as stepping up to the mark, you might say, and saying what it thinks historically. In the event of what's been happening recently, how does Scotland seem to react to what's going on?
I think it's fair to say that Scotland historically has had a very solid and pro-support for the Palestinian cause, and they support the 2-state solution and have been pretty active over the last 20 years. I would say that in recent times, whether it's the targeting of footballers or what's happened to the schools and hospitals and children and civilians in Gaza, has probably brought more people out in the streets than we've ever seen before. I've never seen anything like it, actually. Demonstrations yesterday calling on the British government to stop licences to being exported for parts, for weapons for the Israeli state. More people joining the boycott movement than ever before. It's becoming relevant because people want to see peace for both nations.
So I'll come to Luther Blisset now. Luther, obviously a very difficult scenario when when people say we shouldn't mix politics and sport. And for many years you've been, of course, advocating the show Racism, the Red Card in football. What problems do you face when in this sort of a campaign? I'm just talking the general campaign of trying to separate sport and politics, but still trying to get the right outcome as far as you see it.
Yeah, it is a very difficult thing to do, because the moment politics gets into it, it tends to cloud the issue, and it takes away, I think, from what the fundamental thing is behind all of this, is your basic human right to take part in a sport, whether you do it professionally or do it just for fun. And I think politics sometimes can cloud that when they start to bring so many other things from the past and whatever into it. It can make it difficult. I mean, myself, when I started playing football, we had a lot of discrimination here in England because of me being black. And to get through that, you couldn't go beating on walls and jumping about, screaming and shouting, because really no one would listen to you because you're so few in numbers. But as we sort of became a value to people, to the clubs, then people started to recognise that we should do more to encourage more black players and ethnics to come into the game, which is slowly growing. We still need an awful lot more, which is why our campaign is so important, and we're doing it from a point of view from education. So from young people, we're trying to tell them, we're all the same pretty much, whether, what religion, whatever you are, we are, we're all basically the same, and we're all after the same things, and we should work together to try and do things. And sport is a fantastic means of doing so, because it brings people together yes, it's competition, but it's something that we all love, whether we watch it or whether we like to take part or just casually just glance at what's going on. Sport is absolutely fantastic for that, and I just think it is such a shame that more is not being done you know, from the sporting perspective, for within football, not only just in this country, but all countries, to be talking about, you know, why this problem cannot be solved, why people cannot just get together and talk it over, because we all know war and violence doesn't actually cure anything.
We'll certainly try and unravel that in the next half hour. I'll come to Uriel in a moment because he's nodding in agreement, but I want to go back to Pauline. Pauline, besides sport, we've seen the arts, of course, make their voice very strong. Recent Edinburgh Festival saw an Israeli-funded or an Israeli government-funded theatre group really unable to perform, which again goes to the other side of the argument that it's not just sport, it's the arts in general and other ways besides politics, where people are making their voices heard.
Yes, this is the cultural boycott and what happened at the Edinburgh Festival. I think it's easier to understand why there might be a sporting boycott in football because of the way Palestinian players are treated. They're not competing on equal terms with the other national team, the Israeli team, and we've lost 3 or 4. There's been 4 deaths of well-known Palestinian players. They don't have the same facilities and they don't have the same right to move. So people see the relevance, I think, of that boycott. On the cultural boycott, I don't think there's an official position of any organisation. I think it's more a question of individuals who may see the relevance of it. And I think, I think people do recognise that it is a bit of a shame that performers who are only doing what they do best, they're performing, are getting caught up in something much bigger. But I'm afraid, whether I agree with it or not, I think there's going to be more of this. People want action and they want to put pressure on the state of Israel. And unfortunately, if you're connected to the state of Israel, then you suppose that there will be an impact on whatever that is, because they want to put pressure to bring about a peaceful solution for the Palestinians.
OK, well, let me bring in Uriel Sturm here, because Sepp Blatter has often and has said just before the World Cup that he thinks talking to the Israeli authorities, negotiating is the way forward. But it does sometimes see that Israel only reacts to threats. And if there's a threat of a boycott or a threat of throwing Israel out of any football association, that seems to resonate more. What's your general impression about that?
Well, I'll say first, I am definitely in agreement that sport is perhaps one of the most unifying vehicles out there. Maybe music is on par with that, but it's a really non-political type of way for people to come together. We see it all over the world through the Olympics, the Commonwealth Games, and a whole host of other types of championships or competitions. When it comes to what you're saying about Israel reacting to threats, I think more what's on Israel's frame of mind is a fear. It's a fear of danger that could potentially be posed to it by relaxing some of these issues. I know the Israeli Football Association, the IFA, which is the governing football body here in Israel, wants nothing more than to work with the Palestinian Football Association and to come up with as many ways as possible for them to work in unison to really promote the sport of football and promote peace through football. The military, the Israeli army is the one making a lot of the decisions when it comes to the freedom of access and the freedom of movement for both players as well as you were mentioning, other types of equipment being brought back and forth.
I wanted to touch on that actually. What sort of pressure? Obviously, the Football Association doesn't and is not in charge of barriers and checkposts and the military in Israel when it comes to their own security and the movement of people. So, what sort of pressure? What sort of conversations have you been having as an association with Israeli authorities about the movement of Palestinian athletes and certainly footballers?
So sports definitely does play a big role in society life, but I think security and national security sort of takes a precedence at that. If I were to tell you we are making a birthday party for someone, but there's a chance that if we invite a couple of the guests, they may pose a security issue. And it's a very small chance, but there is that risk. And so you have to assess what is the value on inviting or allowing access, as we're speaking about with players, to have freedom of movement when there's a chance that someone could pose as a soccer player or a football player and then pose a security risk. And that is it's a very real threat to Israeli civilization and to Israeli citizens. No one wants to restrict access. No one is looking to cause a problem for other citizens of any other nationality to do anything. But when it potentially poses a national security threat, there has to be some balance there.
Well, like you say balance, I'm going to bring in Luther Blisset here because, Luther, the accusation certainly, you're not a politician, you are a former footballer, an ambassador as well for the game, but there is a great charge, certainly by Palestinians, to say they are targeted. In recent incidents, 2 footballers, shot in the foot as they came towards a checkpoint. Verbal threats possibly of a boycott of Palestinian sporting teams, or even Israel being punished. In terms of sanctions, or in terms of throwing teams out, or making countries unavailable to perform in situations like the Olympic Games, for example, does it work? Do boycotts work?
I think what boycotts do, they can raise the awareness of something. Do they actually work and make a difference to the actual countries? Not greatly, because ultimately it's the politicians that make those decisions, and unless the people can sort of, in enough numbers, come out and say, we disagree with what you're doing, the politicians really won't bend from whatever way they're going. That's just my personal view on this. So, I think boycotts are all well and good, but what it's got to be more of a collective voices. I mean, when we talk about the cultural things that's going up in Scotland I think if you can get things from culture, things from sport, things from people from all these various other areas can come together and be a more unified, so you get a bigger, stronger voice. I think that's when authorities and people in charge can really, really take notice of what you're saying, because it's not just one small community. This is actually the people themselves talking. And when you get that, I think they take notice, because they have to take notice, because we're the people that put them in office.
Of course, the voice of criticism varies, certainly from the public, in terms of the event. And for example, Qatar's hosting the World Cup in 2022. There is criticism of its human rights record here in terms of the workers that are building the stadiums and its infrastructure. There's criticism of Russia in 2018 and the racism that European clubs have faced when they fielded players that are non-white. So in terms of what you do, how do you then change, or try to persuade or highlight to government officials, to those, as you say, in power, that change is necessary, or that transparency is necessary for this event, or is it going to fail?
Well, I think all you could do is go on the experiences that we've all done. I mean, you go back through the years. I mean, if you look at back through the years, like the civil rights movement, where that started and how that has come through, and if you continually go back and say, that we were wrong, but this, that, and the other, these things never go away. It will always be there. For me, you've got to now start to move forward, and you've got to get people together around the table. And you've got to say, look, if we really want to live in a peaceful world, somewhere where we can coexist and we can compete in sport and all the various other things and communicate properly, we have to talk. And you have to understand that regardless what religion, what colour you are, what nationality you are, what your cultural differences, take those out of the way. We're all the same. We're all exactly the same. And if we're after the same things, why can you not find a way to do it? Just because you are a different nationality, different colour, it should not be a barrier, because the first thing you do is get to know one another. When you get to know people, then I think it's easier to understand who they are, where they're coming from, and what they're all about. And it's that initial fear of not wanting to get to know somebody, I think, which has developed and come to all this. So we just try to use the sort of our experiences that we've had with, especially as black players coming through, that people do fear unknown, people they don't know anything about. So how do you cure that? You have to talk to people. We have a little analogy we talk to kids at school when we go, look, if an alien came to your school tomorrow, what would you do? Would you sort of ignore them, or would you try to get to know them and find out a bit about them, or would you fear them? And you get mixed things. Some kids say, I don't know why. They say, well, what would you do? You talk to them. If somebody new comes to the class, what do? You welcome them. You talk to them and get to know them. And soon that fear goes. And it doesn't matter what nationality, whatever they are. At the end of the day, they're just like you, and they just want to get on and enjoy life. And sport is something that we all enjoy, whether to play, to watch, or just to, as I said before, you know, just keep an eye on it from a distance.
Sure.
It's just a wonderful thing that brings people together.
Well, Uriel Sturm, let me just bring in a point that Luther just mentioned there, is about tolerance. And you touched on it just at the top of this programme. We're talking about the numbers of football teams you have in the Israeli league, over 30. Maybe one of them doesn't have as many Arab or Muslim players in there. I just want to mention something that was a quote from who is now the president of Israel at the moment, Reuven Rivlin. He was then a Knesset member. And it was in criticism of Beta Jerusalem team not wanting to, or certainly its fans not wanting to see Arab players on the team back in January 2013. And he said, just imagine what would have happened if soccer clubs in England or Germany had announced that a Jew cannot join their teams. We, the Jewish people, should lead the fight against racism and fascism. We bear the scars of these phenomena on our bodies for generations to come, cannot and must not stay silent in the face of these calls. It makes you wonder, now that he is the president of Israel, what sort of pressure, because he's from the same party as your prime minister, he could put on Benjamin Netanyahu. What's your opinion about what the president is saying?
I think that sentiment echoed by the then Knesset member, now President Rivlin, is one that resonates with most of Israeli society. The fact that Beitar Jerusalem does not have Arab players on its team is a pock on the Israeli soccer league, the Israeli football league, and that's something that I think most of the society looks down upon the team in that respect. They look at them and say, you know, this is not the way to act, and this is not the way that we should be. And I think every other team does slowly put pressure on them. The Israeli Football Association, as well as now many politicians, are putting pressure on the Jerusalem Football Club to now definitely add Arab players to their team.
In terms of the finances that are attributed to the coffers of the Israeli Football Federation, there aren't any exact publicised figures, but certainly very big sponsorship names are involved in that. Do you think that in the light of this third, you might say, Gaza conflict we've seen recently, big industry, big companies might think twice about sponsoring, for example,